This is the Zelos Podcast with Rocky Snyder, the show that's all about the pros behind the pros. Welcome to this edition of the Zelos Podcast. I'm Rocky Snyder, and with me today is Kate Weiss. Now, Kate is the sports science coordinator, and I hope I got that title right, but she's going to correct me if I'm not, with the World Series champion LA Dodgers. First of all, congratulations on the win, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a crazy season and amazing that we pulled it off.
I gotta say, you've never seen a season like this. When normally there's 164 games, 162 games, and you said we're not going to waste time. We don't need no stinking 162. How many games did you guys play? Not including the playoffs. 60. What do you think about that being just the regular way to go about next baseball season? We just do a 60-game season, call it a day, and go right to the playoffs.
Definitely changes the game and makes every game worth that much more. If you think about it, just from a numbers, perspective, the weight of each game compared to a normal season is, I think, 2.7 games. And then we didn't have quite as many off days either. So a lot of the strategies and things that you might use in a normal season are quite different. And you're playing a lot of the same teams a lot more frequently. So you have to get quite creative with your strategy.
Well, I must say, being born in New England and weaned on Boston sports, the condensed season on any sport doesn't suit me at all. Not at all. The Celtics were out, the Bruins were out, the Red Sox didn't stand a chance. It's a rebuilding decade as far as I'm concerned when it comes to the Patriots. So yeah, not sitting as good as you guys. So tell me first, your role is a sports science coordinator. Could you define sports science, first of all?
Yes. So depending on the team and the organization and how things are structured, sports science can be a number of things. But my specific role with the Dodgers is more so monitoring how much they're training and playing, game type stuff, changes in performance, the actual assessments we use during spring training and during the season, the tech that we use, figuring out what works and what doesn't so that we can make our athletes extremely resilient. In addition to myself, there's another department, performance science, which is much more focused on the technology component and biomechanics. But all of that's obviously considered across the board, and we all work together.
And so are you pursuing means of assessment outside of what you're already doing? Is that your role also, to see what's coming down the pipe for technology, for capturing on video, for force plate assessments or anything like that?
Well, the goal is always for us to use methods that are going to help us assess where athletes at and improve on important qualities. So if sprinting is important, then we need to find a way or we're able to consistently and reliably measure that, and through training and what we do with our strength coaches, improve upon that if that's the case. So if there is a better method for looking at something, or if there's something that we hadn't considered that might be an important component, my job is to kind of help us see if those specific metrics and tools for assessing those are useful for our group, and then to bring them in and figure out how to organically, include it in part of what our guys do.
And how big is your support team? Because I imagine you work with others. You're not the only kind of person looking at that, obviously. How many people do you work with outside of the players, obviously?
So specific to sports science, I am the only person in that dedicated role. And I work with strength and conditioning, medical skills coaches to come up with how we look at things, what we're assessing, to actually implementing the assessments and also the changes that we need to make, player to player, and any sort of other specific things, like if we're trying to build up a newer pitcher or actually make mechanical changes, how do we we adjust other things to make sure that we're able to do that without negatively impacting the player's capacity and performance.
So you meet on a regular basis with the strength conditioning coach, with the athletic trainer, with do you have a team dietitian, or is that more personal between athletes?
We have two, and they also are the chefs for the team. So in addition to doing all the nutritional interventions, they're also cooking for the guys, which I think is a really unique and good thing because it allows them to see, how different guys eat, their preferences and proclivities, and then come up with strategies that the guys are actually going to want to do because it fits how they like to eat.
And so your major role is truly coordinating between all these different disciplines. Which
Yep.
one do you find to be, just your own personal kind of opinion, which are the easier ones to coordinate and which do you find the most challenging?
I don't know that easier would be the term I would use. I think it's more the complexity of certain things, right? So depending on what we're looking at and maybe what we're trying to tweak or change, how we approach that can be very simple and straightforward. And in other instances, like if it's something more specific to a skill, then it can be a little bit more complex. And I think too, with each different group and the individuals that are there, their level of understanding and comfort with sports science is different, and not, it has nothing to do with aptitude. It has more just to do with exposure. So sometimes it's more challenging if there's a little bit more adaptation required to make sure that we're speaking the same language versus someone else where we're already on the same page and maybe we've already been doing something specific for a little bit. So I think that's more the case. But, with each group, different things come up that can be quite challenging to figure out. And honestly, that's why I came to baseball, for the challenge.
That takes me right to that question of how did you get there? Like you landed in a place, and it, yeah, of course, it's a male-dominated sport and so on. We can talk about your emergence into this, your acceptance, and the trials and tribulations. And no, but what got you there? What inspired you, and how did you land that position?
I've always been really lucky to connect with people all along my educational journey and just at conferences and with all sorts of things. So I actually met my boss, the director of performance and athletic development, I believe is his title. I met him through another person that I was doing some work with. And it was just more to connect and to kind of see what baseball was like. And yeah, we just really clicked. And from there, I was offered the position and decided to move into baseball, which is pretty cool.
Very cool. I know in my field, my position, I get athletes from all walks of life and all various sports. And I'm not a sport coach. I'm not a skill coach. I'm more of a movement person. So as long as I can understand their physical needs and demands for their sport, I think that gives me quite a bit of information to help them get to where they want to go. So do you find that you didn't necessarily have to know the ins and outs of baseball to coordinate everything that you're doing right now, but I imagine that you've learned quite a bit in the position that you're in regards to baseball?
Oh, absolutely. I think for me, what I like about working in different sports is the approach is always the same, and that you're trying to figure out what are the needs of the athlete, what are the questions that we have, what are the key areas that we need to look at so that we can improve performance for these guys and mitigate the risk of preventable injury, right? Their job is to play, and our job is to make sure that they can play and play well. So that to me is the same blueprint regardless of the sport. So we're always looking to figure out what questions do we have, what do we need to know in order to make changes, maintain some aspect, or work on something else. So coming in, it was really learning what are the needs of a pitcher versus a position player, and within position players, catchers, infielders, outfielders, utility guys that may play both, to then understand, okay, what do we need to track? What are the types of assessments that might be useful for those specific players or positions rather, and then to go from there. And I think what was really interesting was, as an outsider coming into baseball, I didn't really truly realize how challenging it is to play 162 games that are not an hour, they're several hours. They're traveling every week. Our guys often play on the East Coast, so we're going back and forth across several time zones. You play a game, you get on a plane, you get off a plane, you play another game. At the minor league level, that's a whole other interesting thing, right? You have guys that are moving up and down between levels. They're working on developing specific skills. So there's all sorts of different little things that come into play that I really truly had no idea about prior to coming in. So it was a really fun experience. And then now feeling, a lot more comfortable with my understanding and starting to get a much deeper understanding of the sport and what discerns someone who's at the most elite level to the lower end of an elite level to sub-elite, and the important components of development. It's fascinating and way more than I ever expected.
That's pretty cool. And you mentioned the farm teams or the minor leagues. Are you are are you overseeing that aspect of it too? So
Yes,
not just the majors, not just the active players, but we're talking hundreds of players and the people that are coaching them, you're coordinating all that.
and I'm working with them directly, yes. So it's really fun. Pre-COVID, I'm based with our major league team, but when they would go on the road, I would go to all of our affiliates to visit, check in with players, meet with the staff there in case they had questions or there was a way that I could support or help in some capacity. So it was quite cool because I got to kind of see the whole trajectory of what it's like when you're in rookie ball and high A and triple A and then the majors.
Wow. Yeah, that's a broad spectrum. We've had our share of some of those athletes walk through these doors, and the comfort, the excitement, I mean, just the emotions themselves range quite greatly depending upon if they're seasoned veterans or if they're really just chomping at the bit to get into the majors. That's fascinating.
Exactly.
So I have to ask, baseball is a very incestuous kind of inbred sport. Like if you grew up playing baseball and you're in the majors, chances are you're going to have a career in baseball for your lifetime. But that wasn't your case and I'm sure there's others that are viewed as not going through that whole channel, but how welcome were you? How well were you received?
I consider myself lucky again. People that I work with, when they brought me in, they brought me in such a way where the players got comfortable with me right away. And I spent a lot of time getting to know the staff. My first month there, I went to a pitching conference with our pitching coordinator, which was fun. I was definitely the only woman there. So there was a lot of confusion about who I was and what I was doing from other people at the conference, which was kind of fun. And yeah, from there, I just made sure during spring training to spend a lot of time with all of the athletes, learn everyone's name and something about them so that when I would come in, if I was, testing or doing anything like that, I knew them by name. I could ask questions so that they knew that I was actually trying to get to know them. And that really helped. And I also was very transparent when I didn't understand or know what someone meant, because there's a lot of different baseball terms I would just ask. And I think in doing so, people were really kind and open to, telling me so. it made it pretty straightforward and easy. But I think, with anybody, whether it's baseball or anywhere else, the best way to get into a group is to listen, get to know them. And that's always been kind of my approach, is understanding and learning about these other people before I try to sell anybody on what I'm doing.
Cool. Now, before we got on the air, you were telling me a little bit about your background and how you were very much into dance. You were in a dance company and, of course, inspired by moving the body and fascinated by the human motion, and went to school. Was it USC that you went to for your undergrad? Is that correct?
Yes, I did my undergrad at USC in kinesiology.
And then from there, you went and got a master's in what and where?
Biomechanics from Ball State in Indiana.
Oh man, we could geek out for the entire hour on biomechanics and kinesiology, but we'll save that maybe for another time. I'm asking these questions because there's so many people out there that would love to have your job, by the way. So hold on tight to it. But there's so many aspiring college students, whether they're graduate or undergrad, they're thinking about sports medicine, kinesiology, biomechanics, physical therapy, athletic training, and it'd be great just to understand, maybe to guide them. You say luck, but we know it's more than that. People can be lucky, but they place themselves in positions to be that way. So, what path did you take through your schooling to get you where you are? Aside from happen to meet somebody at the right time and place, so to speak.
When I started undergrad, I really, really loved the biomechanics piece, but I also really liked teaching. And I taught gymnastics, children's gymnastics, when I was in junior high and high school. And I really enjoyed that, and started to teach Pilates and stuff as well while I was in undergrad. And I knew that I wanted to have some aspect of coaching in there, but I had also a lot of questions and ideas that I wanted to explore, which is why I decided to continue on and go into grad school, because I wanted to investigate how these things played into what I was seeing in the weight room, on the field, that sort of thing.
What were you seeing?
So,
what were the questions?
yeah, so everything from, what is the best way to come back from an injury in terms of, rebuilding, right? Looking at movement, not just looking at the injured area itself, but how that impacts the rest of the body, right? So neurologically, there's changes when you have an injury, strength-wise, all of those things come into play. And so I wanted to understand a bit more of that. I knew I didn't want to do physical therapy because I was more interested in preventing an injury from happening than coming back from an injury. And there was actually quite a lot of post-injury research. But to me, if we could understand what was going on, maybe mechanically prior to an injury, then we could start to do things to make sure that you didn't get injured in the first place. So with that, coupled with like the performance piece of how can we make people even better at what they do, I went into grad school, and there I did biomechanics, and I was looking at how fatigue changes mechanics in reactive sidestepping. So when you're on the field and you're reacting to an opponent, it's not a pre-planned movement. And with sidestepping, that's one of the major contributors to non-contact ACL injuries. So I wanted to see pre and post fatigue, what changes in lower extremity biomechanics. Because if we could understand what kinds of changes were happening, maybe there are things that we could do to prevent that from occurring, or at least lower the risk of it happening. And then while I was doing that was when wearables started to get a little bit more traction and momentum. And the thing that I found with the lab-based stuff is a snapshot in time. It's back then it was quite cumbersome to do with all the markers, and then you'd have a marker fly off, and just with the data processing time for 3D mocap, you're looking at maybe several weeks to a month if you had a whole team. And that's a really long time to wait to get feedback. So with that, I knew that I wanted to look more into how could we adapt this to something we could do in the field, right? And that's when I found my PhD program. And one of the biomechanists that I really followed was there. And so I had him as a supervisor, had a strength coach as a supervisor, and a physiotherapist.
Nice.
And it was a really nice mix for me, right? Because it gave me the S&C component, the rehabilitation component, and then the pure mechanical component. And so from there, I did sports science and biomechanics. So looking at using wearables in training, in game, and then also looking at different workload indices for a basketball team.
Oh, all right. You just got me going. I love everything you just said. I could geek out in a laboratory like that, talk to biomechanists and everybody else in your team, and have a blast with that. That's amazing. So it just made sense, of course, that you would fall into the position you're in. Curiously enough, the Dodgers sustained some of the fewest injuries of the season.
We did.
Yeah, that was really nice. And actually look at that as one of the baselines for judging the performance of a team. It's like how often were the players getting injured? And it didn't seem as much. Of course, ACLs, non-contact injuries, that's a huge one. High hamstring pulls, a second one. And maybe inversion sprains potentially, but that's usually with impact on the bases or just cleats catching. Are there other injuries that come to the top of the list when we're talking baseball?
Oh, absolutely. You have your Tommy Johns, right?
Yeah.
Your shoulder injuries, oblique strains can be common both for pitchers and hitters. So there's definitely a number of different things. Even just tendonitis can be an issue. So yeah, something I really like about the Dodgers is we will take players that are injured because we believe in our abilities to rehab them and get them back to where they were. So a lot of our guys actually were injured and coming off of surgery when we either traded for them or drafted them. And to see them, excel and to be injury free is really awesome.
Yeah, the one thing I like about the Dodgers are you guys aren't the Yankees, and being a Red Sox fan, it's really nice to have a team go against the Yankees so often. So, but no, you guys have a great organization down there, and you. Speaking of the injuries, a good deal of that, as I see it, is the one-way rotational nature of the sport. Few players are going to be switch stance hitters. They're either going to be right-handed or left-handed. Same thing, of course, with pitching. Very few pitchers are actually going to throw left and right. So you develop these patterns, these torsion routines, these kinematic sequences that are not mitigated by something that alternates in the opposite direction. However, I imagine that in the off season, and this is just a guess on my part, tell me if this holds any water, that a lot of the players do things that are opposing that. Like some of the baseball players will go and become left-handed golfers. Do you have things like that? Because I know that world champion golf drivers, the long distance, long drive champions, often in the off season have something where they are disc golf throwing or something else, lacrosse, where they're rotating the opposite direction. With your sports science background and the guys that you're working with too, is there anything with that in the off season or even during the season?
Oh, definitely. And I think, one of the major reasons an injury happens is there's a change in mechanics that compromises the structural integrity of the tissue, right?
Yes.
So if you're doing an assessment and you can identify the areas through the chain for that specific movement that need to be strong, stable, fast, powerful, able to create a braking force or propulsive forces, and you can ensure that the sequence of the movement is correct, and you can then build up the tolerance of the tissue to be able to handle those loads. And just like you would with anything else, right? You build up that tolerance. So if mechanics are sound and you build up enough of a load tolerance, you shouldn't have any injuries.
So I
Or
imagine,
not at all, but the likelihood is quite low, right? Because
right.
you've adapted to be able to handle that, and the tissue itself is actually structurally sound and can handle those loads.
Yeah. So, assuming that it's not proprietary property, with your assessment protocol, I imagine you do a global assessment, whether with or without videos capturing and 3D or whatnot, but also segmentally. So, looking at the internal external rotation of the ankle, the knee, the hip, segmentally, as well as connected, as well as spinal rotation. And that's just in the transverse plane. I imagine that you're doing it in all three dimensions, but is there a certain protocol that your team follows in assessment? Are there particular assessments that they do?
I think almost every team's going to do something similar where you're going to have your range of motion testing with your athletic trainers and medical, right? So you're looking to make sure that they have passive range of motion, that's full range of motion, right? Because if your range of motion is constrained, your strength and power are going to go down, and movement variability goes down, which can also be a risk factor for injury. So that, I think, across the board, everyone's going to look at. Then you're going to look at general movement, and then specific movement. You're going to look at the athlete's engine. Are they stable enough? Are they mobile enough? Are they aerobically in a good spot? Speed, strength, lower body, upper body, and then power, right? To see, is there something that's an issue or a limiting factor or needs to be addressed to make sure that they're able to perform and to perform without that risk of injury. So if you have a guy that's hypermobile, it may be that you need to work on stability. Or if they're not very mobile, but they're very stable, then it might be a mobility thing that needs to come into play. Or maybe they're really strong, but they're not that fast, which also is going to impact power, right? So you know that you have to improve their velocity in order to also improve their power. So we're looking at all of those different things, and we're looking at it from a movement standpoint to make sure that we're addressing each of those things that they're going to need.
So with the National Football League, they have the combine, which is just going to give a baseline for every athlete. And whether or not I agree with some of the things in the combine, we're going to put that aside for the time being. I think there's a whole bunch of things that are antiquated that don't have any carryover into really performance, but that's beside the point. Major League Baseball, what's the equivalent of the combine for Major League Baseball?
I believe USA Baseball does a number of assessments with their tournaments for the high school teams, but for most sports, when you're going to be going into the draft, you can have guys come in for workouts. So the NBA does that. Major League Baseball does that. I believe hockey does that as well. So you're actually able to see them potentially. So that process is going to be a lot of the same sorts of assessments you're going to use during spring training and throughout the season with your normal athletes, because you're trying to understand where is that person on the continuum, and how do they look compared to their respective cohort within the organization. It gives you a pretty good indication of maybe what you need to work on once you have them, or if you have guys that on the field are very similar, sometimes using those other testing methods can give you an indication of which person to pick.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes.
All right. Now, the one thing we didn't mention in your team of professionals that you are working with was a sports psychologist. Do you have a team psychologist, or are they just affiliated outside of it?
No, we do have a team psychologist, and then we also have a mental skills department as well.
And what's that like? What's the mental skills department? What are we talking about with that?
So they work primarily with our player development group. So with all of our minor league players. So one of them is fluent in Spanish, so he works with a lot of our Latin players. And the other, they work together. So they're working on lots of different skills that help these guys on and off the field, right? So how to mentally, prepare when you're on the mound and it's a difficult situation. You have runners on base and you have one out left, and how do you handle that? So they're working on the very specific skills to address all of that stuff. Even just separating what's happening in the game from what's happening in life can be a really important skill. And for our international players, also just adjusting to cultural differences and vice versa. We're also very much focused on making sure that our guys from the States are culturally sensitive to our international players as well.
So for each player, what I'm envisioning that you have is you've got a thick file on every player. And in that file, we're going to have information about their strength conditioning program, off season, on season, postseason, and so on. You're going to have what their nutritional plan is, what their dietary needs are, what the mental skills coach and the team psychologist are considering. This is the priority, as well as the on-field coaching of what these guys are working on. Is that accurate?
Oh yes, and you'll find that in any sport. It's performance is very holistic and it involves so many different aspects, right? Psychological, physiological, actually physical, mechanical, all of that comes into play. And so we definitely focus on making sure we cover all of those things for our players and making sure that as a group we're on the same page too.
Do you do sleep studies by chance? Because we have so much traveling in different time zones. Do you watch what their biorhythms are or anything like that? I mean, how deep do you get into this?
We definitely look at sleep as one of the components, because if you're not sleeping, it's very hard to recover and be ready to play again. So sleep is definitely something that we look at and work on with our guys as well.
So is there tech that you're using like the Fitbit or something like that, which is going to record the player's sleep patterns or how much restful sleep they'll get? Or is it only when it may be something that's a consideration that you want to measure?
So it's a bit of a mix. A lot of MLB players have Whoop bands. So Whoop band or a ring, those are all things you can use, as well as just subjective sleep assessments. And even from there, depending on the athlete and the need, we can get as focused and specific as we need to. There's so many different options available, and it can be tailored to the individual.
And do you deal with I won't say the equipment manager, but the acquisition of equipment and not just bats? I mean, there's specifications that every player must be confined to, but in terms of footwear, performance underclothing or anything like that, how scientific are we getting there?
It really depends on the player and how much they want input on certain things. A lot of guys are sponsored, so the equipment comes from the company that they work with, and a lot of it is made specifically for them. So that's not necessarily something that I have to sit and troubleshoot with them unless it's something that comes up. And we do always offer whatever they need in that regard, but a lot of them do have, their sponsors, Marucci or whoever, Nike, shoes, all sorts of equipment. So they're going to have a lot of that already. And I think that's true for a lot of sports. But yeah, we offer whatever they need. And so in terms of the equipment and the tech, we always have new companies coming through with different new toys and gadgets. And depending on what it is and what it does and questions that we have or needs that we have, that allows us to be a little bit more discerning with what we decide to demo and, actually end up purchasing. So for us, I don't need a million things that do the same thing. I just need one that's easy and straightforward to use and that gives us good information. So there's a million wearables, there's a million, different things. You just want the one that you're actually going to be able to use and that works. So that's part of what I do, is to look at those things and help the team make an assessment as to what to use.
Very good. Now we're obviously in the off season right now. Preseason begins in a few months. What's your role right now in between seasons? What do you are you gearing? Obviously, you're gearing up for next season. Or do you have to close up your book, so to speak, your office? I mean, what role are you playing at this moment that is different than when you're in season?
So in a normal off season, we have guys, we open our major league and our spring training facilities to anyone that wants to come in to train. So last off season, we had anywhere between 20 and 30 players with us in LA, 5 days a week. And then I think they had almost the same amount in Arizona as well. So in the off season, we're still, testing guys, looking at data, really trying to improve upon certain things for each player that we have, and just training. So that's usually 5 days a week. Right now it's a little bit different with COVID, unfortunately, but in a normal off season, we're busy, but in a different way. And also we do a lot of continuing education during the off season as well.
Continuing education for yourself?
For the whole group. So we have a lot of people come in.
And do in-service work.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, very good, very good. Now, with the advanced technology, with different concepts in the field of strength conditioning as well as athletic training and so on, what is the trend, if there is one right now, that you're seeing that is infiltrating Major League Baseball? Like when it comes to promoting better performance, is there one thing that you're seeing above all else that's trending? And can you share that?
I think definitely a lot more players are getting interested in tracking sleep and recovery and that sort of thing. And I think as a lot of the different performance tech, continues to grow and develop and get better, I think a lot of players are more interested in using it to help improve performance. So whether that's pitching or hitting or other, specific things on field, a lot of them are starting to get more interested in using it. And, if they aren't training at a facility and let's say they have something at home, maybe even having some of that stuff there too.
And in regards to performance enhancement, I instantly go back to the days of Sammy Sosa and McGuire and Bonds and the rest of them. It doesn't seem to be in the news that that's occurring, but how do you keep such things, PEDs, performance enhancement drugs, out of the clubhouse? What is it yeah, why is that not happening?
I mean, personally, I haven't really felt like we needed to go out of our way to make sure of that. I think that's pretty much instilled in the players. They're tested year round, in season, off season. So I know that,
has changed.
Yes, definitely. And I think too, the game's changed. There's people are starting to realize that you don't need that to be really good. And I think that as they get more engaged in what they're doing and they can see, actually what's nice about tech is that you can see and measure even small changes that I think before we just couldn't detect as easily. So I think when you can see that, it helps mentally when you feel like you're not making improvements. You have something else that you can actually look at and go, wow, okay, I didn't feel like maybe I was there yet, but obviously I am improving, and I'm improving because I'm training 5 days a week in the off season, and I'm getting 8 hours of sleep and I'm eating enough. it makes the basics a lot easier to sell when you can see how much that improves things.
Yeah, I think if there is something that's trending more and more, it's sports nutrition. That's really coming into play, at least from different sports, of having a better dietary plan. But of course, that has trends in itself too that I'm sure you see that you're going to have. Well, I imagine you say you've got the team dietitians and they're also the chefs. But does that mean that all the team are using them, or do some opt out and try and go and have somebody else do that for them?
For the most part, everyone seems to use them because they're quite good and they've,
Fantastic.
they're with the team. And I think one of the things with nutrition, right, is finding something that fits your lifestyle and that's easy. And I think the benefit that we have of them being there all the time is that they can adapt what they do for a person based on their lifestyle and what they enjoy and what works. And that lowers that resistance and that barrier to entry and makes it a lot more seamless and easy to do. And so I think because of that, they don't really have to go elsewhere. And you can troubleshoot with them any day you're there, which is pretty much every day. And we can measure changes and all of that. So it just makes it really easy.
Very cool. Now, of course, you can't foresee the future, but uh, going into the spring, how are you preparing for the next season?
I think the thing that's always important is to look over the season and to be able to see what worked well for guys, where they improved, and, kind of come up with a plan for how can we help them be even better, right? So making sure that the information that you're presenting is stuff that you can actually impact is important. I think being able to show the players specifically where they're at and how they did, really highlight their strengths and tie it back to what you do, whether that's their, warm up routine with the skills coach, what they do in the weight room, their shoulder programs with the athletic trainers and medical, whatever it is, just making sure that they can see how these things that make them really good at what they do are made even better by these things that we have for them. And that helps to continue to move them forward and give them that incentive that, hey, when I train 3 days a week, I feel great. I run faster, I hit harder, whatever it is. So yeah, really the big thing is looking at how they did, where they improved, maybe where they stagnated a little bit, and then having an idea of the things that you really want to focus on for them going into the next season.
And speaking of this last season, obviously being World Series champions, there were several things that you did right. Is there one that stands out more than anything else? Obviously, having the wins is a critical thing, but is there a component within the team structure or even the individual players that just clicked that you can say, okay, we definitely need to have that reoccur this season, and how we're going to do it?
A lot of things went really well. And I think to answer that question, I'm going to answer to the things that are more so in the realm of what I'm looking at versus having players that are excellent at baseball and have a depth and understanding of the sport that is hard to teach. I think something that the staff did really well was when we were all on lockdown, we made sure to come up with a plan and something that each player could do to be able to continue to train and make sure that they were building themselves up so that whenever the season started, and keep in mind, we really didn't know when that was going to happen for a while, they were ready. And that's something that was done quite well. And I think a lot of it had to do with how the staff worked together as a group and made sure that we were on the same page and continued to stay in touch with our players and address questions and specific needs and get creative in order to make sure that they had what they needed.
How quickly were you able to turn that around? Because it was basically LA and LA. I think they were a day ahead of San Francisco. So March 16th, March 15 or 16, I think is when you guys went on shutdown, right? Somewhere around there. At what point in time did you have a plan?
Well, we were in Arizona. We got shut down right before spring training ended.
Ah,
So we really didn't know what was happening, and we all had to kind of head back to our respective homes if we could. Some of our players that lived elsewhere that couldn't go home, we had to figure out a place for them to be that was safe. So when that started, we really had no idea what to expect. And so even still, we did what we would do in an off season, which is continue to check in with the players and have a plan, something that they could adapt and do on their own. And that, that was everything from S&C, medical, skills coaches, all of that. So people got to work right away and started moving with that. So that, I think, is what really made a difference. We didn't wait. We got on top of things right away. The players stayed engaged, which really helped. And we just adapted as needed.
wow. So you had no time off. You just hit the ground running.
We did. Yeah.
Okay. So last question, because we're coming up against the clock. What are you looking forward to? Inside and outside of baseball, career-wise or life-wise? What's getting, aside from getting you up in the morning and going and working with some amazing athletes, where do you see yourself?
That's a great question. I am just looking forward to seeing how, things continue to evolve and change in this specific field. It's been very fast moving, and I really enjoy that part of it because there's always something new or, different to learn and to try and to bring into your specific group and your practice. And yeah, I think I'm just open to whatever comes up next. I like new challenges and working with different groups. So hopefully in the future, that'll be coming up for me too.
Well, I hope you have as successful of a season this coming year as you did last year. Obviously, it's always great to see teams go back to back. So, and it sounds like you've got all your players off the field and on the field just where you want them. So I wish you all the best, and thanks for being on.
And that's it for this episode of the Zelos Podcast. Thanks, Kate Weiss and the LA Dodger organization for spending some time with us this week. If you missed last week, be sure to get that episode downloaded onto your device. Dr. Gary Gray with Gray Institute was phenomenal in terms of giving us a whole bunch of information on functional training, as he is the godfather of. Next week, Ridge Kiley. You want to talk about functional training? He is the strength conditioning coordinator and coach for Cirque du Soleil in Vegas. So be sure to tune in next week, and thanks for listening.